Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told as Podcast, where we, dive deep into these fascinating stories from history, science, and culture.
Absolutely.
So imagine, okay, ready? You're on this massive oil rig,
Okay.
miles offshore,
Yeah.
drilling deep down into the ocean floor.
Uh-huh.
Suddenly, there's this deafening roar, and the whole rig is just engulfed in flames.
Oh, wow.
This isn't some scene out of Hollywood, though.
Yeah.
This is the true story of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And that's what we're going to unpack today. So let's set the stage.
Okay. Sounds good.
So tell me about the Deepwater Horizon. What was it?
So the Deepwater Horizon was, like a marvel of engineering. It was this really towering symbol of how much we all rely on oil, right?
Yeah.
It's operating in the Gulf of Mexico,
Right.
which is this body of water that's just teeming with life. I mean, everything from tiny little plankton all the way up to these giant whales, It's a really delicate ecosystem. And the Deepwater Horizon was right smack in the middle of it all.
So we've got this massive structure drilling thousands of feet below the ocean floor, and it's right in this vibrant, delicate ecosystem.
Right.
I mean, what could possibly go wrong right
Well,
now?
on April 20th, 2010, everything changed.
Yeah.
Methane gas, which was trapped under immense pressure, deep beneath the ocean floor, it surged upwards into the wellbore.
Okay.
And this triggered just a catastrophic explosion
Wow.
that completely engulfed the platform in flames.
It sounds absolutely terrifying. What happened to the people on board?
Well, tragically, 11 workers, they lost their lives in the chaos.
Oh, wow.
And, their deaths they serve as this stark reminder of the human cost that comes with our pursuit of energy.
It's just heartbreaking to think about those families, you
Yeah.
know. So the rig explodes, and then what happens?
So as the Deepwater Horizon sank beneath the waves, another disaster started to unfold. Oil started gushing uncontrollably from the wellhead, which was a mile below the surface.
Okay, so oil's spilling into the Gulf. How much oil are we talking here?
Well, estimates vary, but it's believed that around 4.9 million barrels of oil spewed into the Gulf over 87 days.
87 days.
87 days.
Wow.
So to put that into perspective, that's roughly 205 million gallons of oil.
That is an incredible amount of oil. So
Yeah.
what did they even do to try to contain a disaster like that?
So they deployed these things called remotely operated vehicles, ROVs.
ROVs?
ROVs, yeah. They're basically underwater robots
Oh, okay.
to try and activate the blowout preventer.
A blowout preventer. What is that?
Yeah, so think of it as this giant valve
Okay.
that's designed to shut off the flow of oil in an emergency.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. And did it work?
Unfortunately, no. The force of the explosion had damaged the blowout preventer,
Okay.
making it totally useless.
Wow.
They also tried lowering a massive dome over the wellhead to try to capture the oil,
Okay.
but that failed too. Because of these things called icy methane hydrates.
Methane hydrates. What are those?
Okay, so imagine this slushy ice-like substance
Yeah.
that forms when methane gas combines with water under really high pressure and low temperatures. So these hydrates basically clogged the dome, preventing it from sealing properly.
Wow.
It was a major setback for the containment efforts.
So they're battling this relentless gusher of oil a mile beneath the surface.
Yeah.
They're facing all these technical challenges, stuff they've never encountered before.
Right.
What was happening above the water at this point?
So above the water, the oil was spreading rapidly. It formed this massive slick that stretched for miles across the Gulf.
Wow.
And it started reaching the shores of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida,
Wow.
coating the beaches with this thick black sludge.
That must have been devastating to witness.
It was, and the impact on the wildlife was just horrific too.
Right.
Countless birds, fish, dolphins, and other marine life were coated in the oil. They were struggling to survive in this toxic environment. The images were heartbreaking.
Yeah, I remember seeing those images on the news.
Yeah.
It felt like watching this ecological nightmare unfolding in real time.
It really was. And while the visible impact on the surface was shocking, there was also this other less visible threat, emerging methane gas.
Right. You mentioned that earlier. Why was the methane gas such a big deal?
So methane is a really potent greenhouse gas.
Mhm.
It's way more effective at trapping heat in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide.
Really?
Yeah, and the Deepwater Horizon spill released enormous amounts of methane,
Wow.
which just added another layer of complexity to an already really dire situation.
So this wasn't just an oil spill. It was also like a major contributor to climate change.
Exactly. This disaster had repercussions way beyond the Gulf itself, impacting the global climate in ways we're still trying to fully understand, honestly.
This is a fascinating deep dive, isn't it? It's amazing how one single event can have such far-reaching consequences.
Yeah.
You know what? Before we go any further, I just want to remind our listeners to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any more of these captivating stories from Tell Me More. We'll be right back after a short after.
We were talking about all that methane gas released during the spill and the impact on climate change, but what's kind of fascinating is that the spill also really impacted ocean currents.
Really? That's interesting. I don't think I've ever heard about that. How did an oil spill affect ocean currents?
Well, so the Gulf of Mexico, it's a dynamic body of water, right? It's got
Mhm.
these complex currents, and they play a really vital role in regulating temperature, and distributing nutrients.
Uh-huh.
And when all that oil spilled, it created this like massive plume
Yeah.
that interacted with the currents in some really unexpected ways.
So the oil disrupted the natural flow of the ocean.
Exactly. Studies have actually shown that the oil spill changed both the speed and direction of some of the currents.
Wow.
And that can have cascading effects on, marine life and even weather patterns. It's just another example of how interconnected our planet really is.
Right.
And how these seemingly localized events can have global consequences.
It's like throwing a wrench into this complex machine. You might fix the immediate problem, but the ripple effects, you just feel those throughout the whole system.
Exactly. And those ripple effects, those are often really difficult to predict.
Right.
And even harder to try and mitigate.
So, okay, we've got this massive oil spill impacting ocean currents, releasing methane into the atmosphere. It's affecting everything. What about the cleanup? What did they even do to try and clean up this mess?
So the cleanup operation, it was unprecedented, just the scale and the complexity of it all.
Yeah.
They used a whole variety of different methods, like skimmers, to scoop the oil off the surface, controlled burns to incinerate the oil. And they used dispersants to break the oil down into smaller droplets.
I remember those images of the controlled burns on the news.
Yeah.
The plumes of black smoke billowing into the sky. It looked apocalyptic.
It was definitely a dramatic approach, and a controversial one, too.
Yeah.
I mean, it did get rid of a lot of the surface oil, but it also released all these harmful pollutants into the air,
Right.
which raised a lot of concerns about the impact on air quality and also human health,
So it was kind of a trade-off then. Reduce the oil on the surface, but potentially create other problems.
Yeah, there weren't any easy solutions, and the use of dispersants was also very controversial.
Right. Remind me again what those are and why they were so controversial.
Sure. So dispersants are basically chemicals. They act kind of like soap,
Okay.
and they break down the oil into those smaller droplets,
Right.
which can then be degraded by the natural microbes.
Okay.
The whole idea is to reduce the amount of oil that's going to reach the shores, and impact those sensitive ecosystems.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what was the problem with them?
Well, dispersants, they can be effective, in certain situations.
Yeah.
But they do come with risks. They can be toxic to marine life.
Yeah.
And there was a real concern that using them might push the oil deeper into the water column.
Mm-hmm.
And that would then impact the deep sea ecosystems, which are already under a lot of stress.
So it's another one of those classic dilemmas. You're trying to
That's-
mitigate one problem, but you might be creating another one.
Exactly. And that's a really recurring theme with a lot of environmental disasters. There are often no perfect solutions, only these difficult choices with really complex consequences.
We've talked about the spill itself, the environmental impact, the cleanup efforts. I mean, it's a lot. What about the people? How did this disaster impact the people that lived and worked along the Gulf Coast?
The human toll was immense. And, we already talked about the 11 workers who died in the explosion, but the impact went far beyond that.
In what ways?
Well, for starters, it completely devastated the fishing industry. I mean, huge areas of the Gulf were shut down for fishing because of contamination concerns.
Yeah.
And that left so many fishermen without a source of income,
It's got to be incredibly difficult for those families who rely on that for their livelihoods.
Absolutely. And the tourism industry, that was also hit really hard.
Right.
All those images of the oil-soaked beaches, you know? It scared tourists away,
Yeah.
which cost the region billions of dollars in lost revenue. So many businesses were forced to close. People lost their jobs. It was an economic disaster on top of the environmental one.
It's hard to imagine that sense of loss and uncertainty that those communities must have felt.
And then there's the health impacts, which were a major concern too.
Right.
Cleanup workers and residents, they all reported a whole range of health problems.
Yeah.
Respiratory issues, skin rashes, mental health problems.
It's just heartbreaking to think about those long-term consequences for people.
It is, and the full extent of the health impacts are still being studied. We're only just beginning to understand what those long-term effects of exposure to oil and dispersants are. It's a really complex issue with a lot of unanswered questions.
So we're talking environmental damage, economic hardship, health problems. It's a multifaceted tragedy.
Yeah.
What about accountability? Did anyone face consequences for this disaster?
Yeah, there were really significant legal and financial repercussions. BP, the company that leased the Deepwater Horizon,
Right.
they faced multiple investigations and lawsuits.
And what did those investigations reveal?
Well, they found a whole series of failures that led to the disaster.
Okay.
Problems with the cementing of the well, which is
Right.
crucial to prevent blowouts.
Yeah.
And there were issues with the blowout preventer itself, which, as we said, failed to activate.
So it sounds like multiple points of failure.
Yeah, a whole cascade of events that ultimately led to this catastrophe.
Wow.
And the investigations also revealed this culture within BP, a culture of cost-cutting and risk-taking. They had made decisions that put speed and efficiency above safety,
Right.
and ultimately those decisions had tragic consequences.
It's like that classic case of corporate greed and negligence leading to disaster.
It's a cautionary tale, that's for sure. It shows us the dangers of prioritizing profits over people and the environment. And it reminds us that we need strong regulations and oversight to prevent these kinds of tragedies from happening again.
It's just mind-boggling, how all these seemingly small decisions can lead to such a massive disaster.
Right.
So what happened to BP after all of this? I mean, did they face any real consequences?
Oh, absolutely. They ended up paying billions of dollars in fines and settlements.
Billions.
Billions. It was actually the largest environmental damage settlement in U.S. history.
Wow. That's a lot of money. But
Yeah.
is it really enough to hold a company accountable for that much damage?
That's a tough question. I mean, there's really no easy answer. Some people argue that those financial penalties, while significant, they don't fully address the long-term environmental and economic damage.
Right.
But others believe that the fines, along with the damage to the company's reputation, they serve as a pretty strong deterrent for future negligence.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if there's any way to prevent these kinds of disasters from happening in the first place.
Yeah, and that's where the conversation about safety regulations and industry practices comes in.
Right.
The Deepwater Horizon disaster, it really sparked a wave of reforms aimed at improving safety standards in offshore drilling.
So did anything actually change because of this?
Yeah, there were actually some pretty significant changes. For example, they put in place all these new regulations to strengthen the well design and cementing procedures.
Right, those crucial steps we talked about earlier.
Exactly. And they also started putting a much greater emphasis on blowout preventer testing and maintenance to make sure that they are in top working order.
Well, those sound like really positive steps. But is it enough? Can we really ever eliminate the risk of another Deepwater Horizon?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? But the reality is, anytime we're dealing with complex technologies and unpredictable environments, there's always going to be some level of risk.
Right.
But what we can do is learn from these past mistakes.
Yeah.
Implement stricter regulations and foster a culture of safety that puts human lives and the environment above everything else.
It's a sobering thought that our pursuit of energy always comes at a cost, and we have to weigh those costs really carefully.
I agree. The story of the Deepwater Horizon, it's a stark reminder of how interconnected our world really is and these profound consequences of our actions.
Right.
It's a story that challenges us to think critically about our energy choices, demand accountability from those in power, and really advocate for a more sustainable future.
Yeah. It's a story that really stays with you. It makes you think about the bigger picture. Well, thanks for diving deep into this with us today.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on Tell Me More Stories Told as podcast. We hope this deep dive into the Deepwater Horizon oil spill has been insightful and thought-provoking. Remember, every story has something to teach us, so keep exploring, keep learning, and keep telling your own stories.